My name is Brooke Fife, and I am a senior history major at James Madison University. Before I begin, I would like to thank my advisor, Dr. Skip Heiser, and my former professor, Dr. Shah Hanafi, whose class resulted in the creation of this presentation. Today, I will be discussing British mapmaking and the politics of clothing in colonial India. While mapmaking and clothing may initially appear to have nothing in common, both can be used as a way to study the process and societal impacts of British colonialism in India. Throughout history, maps have been used to provide context and arguments for different time periods. This is especially true with British mapmaking in colonial India, whose roots began in the European Enlightenment movement. Enlightenment theories provided the structure and basis that the field of mapmaking will rely on, since mapmaking was seen as being composed of both theory and practical skills. These skills were tied into a sense of Enlightenment rationality. To the British, everything they did had a rational basis, whereas everything that Indians did was considered to be irrational. Military schools were then established to teach Indians how to portray their thoughts in the British way, teaching everything from geometry to land surveying. Through these schools, maps became invaluable sources of military strategy and reflected the increasing militarization of maps. With the Enlightenment, the British could do no wrong in mapmaking because any mistakes would be explained away as a matter of rational science. Science was further brought into mapmaking through astronomy. Astronomical observations were used to determine the latitude of a place by determining its location on the celestial sphere, particularly in regards to its relation to the moons of Jupiter. These observations became increasingly accurate and a common practice in the mapmaking profession. Astronomy paved the way for latitude/longitude use in maps and led to the formation of surveys. There are four types of surveys used by the British Empire in mapmaking colonial India: topographic, based on physical features of the land; route, which used expensive and often incorrect compasses; cadastral, or who owned what land; and triangulation, which used triangles as a form of measurement. Of the four types of mapmaking listed above, triangulation was used by the British to be the most progressive or scientific, which ultimately led to their increased use in the formation of the Great Trigonometrical Survey. The Great Trigonometrical Survey, also known as the GTS, was founded as Britain's main mapmaking organization that focused on the creation of these surveys, using tools such as the theodolite, pictured to the left, and the plane table. These tools were used to create maps that were supposedly infallible, but did not take into account the high likelihood of human error or differing experiences among cartographers. A British surveyor's experience was viewed as absolute, and they were always correct in their experiences. However, cartographers would often add details to their maps after the fact based off of frameworks of European ideals. The British knowledge of the geography of India was constantly changing, and as knowledge changed, so did the maps themselves. The knowledge used to create most maps thus became a combination of British viewpoints and indigenous sources. The two viewpoints would then be generalized into an overarching view of supposed accuracy, since the source was only deemed true if it coincided with British thought processes. As a result, the British lost potentially useful knowledge of the terrain, and each map looked slightly different even if the cartographers were at the same place at the same time. To counteract experiences, a compilation of maps was established through the creation of a geographic archive, where maps were made off of the basis of other maps. Ultimately, these maps not only became important military sources to the British Empire and colonial India, they were also responsible for the creation of a capitalist mapmaking market. Through the map-making market, maps became the basis for orientalized images of a wild and mysterious place often thought of in association with India today. The images of an Orientalist India and the supposed irrationality of Indians, seen with Indian informants in map-making, could then also be seen in another important aspect of British colonialism: clothing. Clothing was an important part of European colonialism. Indian clothing, or the meaning of Indian clothing, was altered to fit into previously held European mindsets. This is particularly relevant when looking at the significance of the Sikh turban. The Sikh turban was initially identified with the Sikh religion by the British, who believed that the turbans were spiritual by nature. The Sikhs became viewed by the British as the most manly and brave group of Indians, and the turban gave the British a way to identify them from afar. Recently, Sikhs have altered the meaning of turbans to become a form of self-identity and unification. A British mindset was altered for Indian purposes, and clothing became an object that distinguishes one group of people from another. The differences in clothing were also evident in the health that was associated with British clothing. In Britain, it was assumed that more clothing worn equal greater health benefits. The cummerbund in particular became associated with rejecting disease. These British mindsets then impacted what the British wore in public versus what they wore in private. Clothing was once again used as a way to separate British and Indian forces. In public, clothing became a tool to show the supposed superiority of the English over the Indians. Clothing here becomes a matter of cultural significance, which can be seen in the Orientalization of the Indian Army. Indians would be forced to wear clothing that was thought of by the British as Indian by nature, and clothing became a tool for the empire's use. Another example of how the British used clothing as a tool for the empire's use was with the bestowal of the Star of India. The Star of India had symbolic power and would be given to an Indian in a process similar to knighthood. The Star of India itself showed a conflict between British and Indian ideals that would ultimately result in rebellion against the British Empire. The rebellion began in a matter of clothing, so to speak, starting with the implementation of Mahatma Gandhi's uniform for the Indian National Congress. The uniform consisted of a cap covering the head that went against the idea of pagri, or more traditional head coverings, that was important due to the symbolism of the head. The head was considered to be a way to see/interact with deities, and the feet were the exact opposite. The British and Indians acknowledged this, so Gandhi used a cap and a cloth known as khadi to promote the idea of Swadeshi. According to author C.A. Bailey, Swadeshi refers to the boycott of British goods and buying local Indian goods. While the boycott of the goods themselves had limited success, the themes and ideals of Swadeshi came to be applied to any form of rebellion against the British, particularly in the realm of clothing. Gandhi takes the idea of Swadeshi and applies it to khadi. Khadi then undergoes a change from a degraded and dirty form of clothing to a pure and culturally important form of clothing. The purity and importance of khadi emerged not only from Gandhi's politics, but it could also be seen in the push for khadi by local business owners, as well as an art revival occurring at a similar time. Khadi becomes a symbol of rebellion, an economic boom for local clothing businesses, and an important art feature in Indian culture. By focusing on local Indian goods through Swadeshi, Gandhi made an act of rebellion against the British inherently tied to economics, clothing, and politics. Both the politics of clothing and British mapmaking impacted how colonial India was perceived. By looking at these two topics in depth, historians can learn more about the relationships between British colonists and Indians and the societal impacts of British colonialism in India.